Hello, welcome to the last episode of Axis of Resistance initiative at the Global and National Security Institute. As I promised you all earlier on, today we are having our finale conversation, the last assessment, with our Executive Director, General Frank McKenzie. General McKenzie has served in uniform for 42 years. He graduated from Citadel in 1979 and right after joined the Marine Corps. In 2014, he was promoted to the Lieutenant General position. In 2015, he was appointed as the Director of J5 at the Joint Staff. In 2017, he was appointed as the Director of the Joint Staff. 2019, he was appointed as the Director of the Central Command, a position that he continued until 2022 when he retired from the service. During his command in the CENTCOM, he oversaw many unique, specific, and significant operations. The elimination of the Abu Bakr Baghdadi, the head and the leader of the ISIS, the killing of the General Soleimani, the commander of the Iranian IRGC Quds Force, and the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. All of this is making him a unique character with a unique experience. And today we have the privilege of hosting him and sharing his insight on the axis of resistance with you. Well, thank you, General, once again for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
Very nice of you. I want to ask you a question, actually take you back in the time. You graduated from Citadel in 1979, and in the same year, you joined the Marine Corps. In 1979, I assume millions of people across the world joined services. But there is another man who at the same time joined the uniform, and it seems later on your path and your fate were kind of crossed, and that was Iran's Qasem Soleimani. 1979, he joins Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards, and his first mission was to be deployed to Kurdistan to fight against the Kurdish uprising. From there, he was said to, at one point in his lifetime, to be one of the primarily architects of the Iran's axis of resistance, the Iran system of proxies. And you were destined to be the commander of the CENTCOM, and evidently a force against that resistance. But what I want to ask you, in 1979, which was an atmosphere of the hostage crisis, Iranian revolution, the beginning of the gradual hostility in Persian Gulf between these two countries, what was a young Frank McKenzie's interpretation of the Middle East, of Iran? And did you at the time think that the hostilities between two nations would go to continue for about a half a century? Because it is almost half a century now.
So I'll actually start with the last part of your question first. And when I graduated in May of 1979, and for the first year or two of my career in the Marine Corps, I had no idea or expectation that we would still be intractably opposed with Iran as we are today. No idea that that would carry on for that long. And as you know better than anyone, really up until the late 1970s, Iran had been a significant ally of the United States and a bulwark against communist expansion, Soviet expansion to the south toward the oil fields. So that was the Iran that I grew up with. And as I graduated, of course, we were focused on Russia and all the problems associated with Russia. But gradually, we began to study the Middle East in a changed context. And that context, of course, was the revolutionary Iran and what it brought to the region. I'll certainly never forget, I was a second lieutenant on Okinawa in April 1980 when the failed rescue attempt became public for the first time, when we went to try to get our hostages out from Tehran, and of course had a mishap and lost U.S. lives in the Iranian desert. I'll never forget that very clearly. But that really marked a time for me when I began to think about Iran.
The Operation Eagle Claw?
Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned the Soviet Union. When it comes to the studying of the Middle East, and first of all, I'm glad that you're very honest. Most people would say that, I knew at the time everything would happen, what would happen, but I appreciate your sincerity and honesty. What I wanted to ask, because you mentioned that you were focused, like many others, on Soviet Union. When we look at the events in the Middle East, from 1970s, 80s, till the collapse of Soviet Union in December 1991, there is a tendency to in American intelligence community is that the Soviet is hijacking or Soviet affair or taking over the way that they have to study Middle East. And the reason that I'm saying that is from 1975 to 1979, Central Intelligence Agencies, officers in Tehran, at least write 3 reports about the state of the Iran, state of the Shah. In all 3 reports, without any exclusion, they make an assumption that the Shah is going to survive. As long as he's alive, there would be no change. He has a phenomenon grasp of power. They couldn't be any more wrong. I mean, the time proved it. He died in exile. And the reason that I'm outlining is that I want to ask you that when it comes to the axis of resistance, Iran's system of proxies, which is across the region from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, to what extent lack of knowledge of the Middle East or lack of the cultural knowledge, if there was any lack, contributed to, I don't want to say Americans' inaction, but to Americans' tolerance of the rise of the axis of resistance?
So the United States struggles with a profound misunderstanding, lack of understanding of what goes on in the Middle East. Americans, by nature, we are short-term people. Our nation is young. We have a short-term perspective. Iran is an imperial culture that goes back thousands of years. And so we are mismatched from the beginning. Americans, a long time ago, as last month, to an Iranian, it could be as easily 500 or 1,000 years ago. And that Americans are not equipped to deal with that. And I would argue, we've never made the deep study of Iran that needs to be made. First as a potential ally during the Cold War, and now as an opponent. Not a potential opponent, but an actual opponent in the years following that. We've never learned to understand that, Iran they're not Arabs. It's a different culture with a different history, with a very proud history. And I've said many times in many public venues, Iran is going to be around. They're not going away. It's a nation that's going to be a regional hegemon. Our task is to fit them into the region in a way where the rights of others are actually respected by Iran. But the idea that Iran's going to disappear somehow, it's not going to happen. It's been around a long time. It's been for millennia, and it's going to be around for a long time in the future. We need to know and understand that, even if we find the current form of government reprehensible, and I certainly do.
So are you suggesting that the goal shouldn't be containing Iran, the rise of Iran as a regional power? The goal should be making sure the right Iran would arise as a regional power.
I think Iran is going to be a regional power. The question is, how do we want it to be manifested? And yes, we would prefer that it be manifested in useful ways that respect international commerce on the high seas, where they don't meddle with their neighbors. All of those things that we would say mean maturity and membership in the family of nations. Iran, as you know, consistently rejects that. They see themselves as a revolution in being. Whether they are or not is another matter, but they certainly do. And so I come back to sort of the point I began with. Iran's not going away, so we shouldn't talk about that. What we need to talk about is how we're going to manage them, how we're going to control and direct that energy that exists within Iran toward purposes that serve our goals.
And I'm asking this because it has something to do with my upcoming question. When you say that Iran is not going away and it's going to stay around, is because of the natural capacity of Iran to project power?
I think it's not so much to project power, the natural, I would say the staying power of Iran, the ability of the nation to take punishment and remain and keep its footing. Look, they went through the Iran-Iraq war, and that was a long, bloody war that no one in this country understands. But that had a profound effect on Iran, as it did also on Iraq. If you want to study modern Iran, you need to study the Iran-Iraq war, a very bloody war where it approached World War I in terms of casualties and in terms of weapons that were used.
Thank you for saying that. The reason that I'm asking this is that I ask about the natural capacity, the idea of endurance of pain that you mentioned. Is when it comes to Iran's rise as a regional power, the general stereotype out there is that it's mostly out of fortuna, or the way that Machiavelli says that either fortuna or virtua. They say for Iran is fortuna is luck. And there is evidence to it. When we look at the rise of some of the Iranian militias, we would see that chaos played a role. For instance, Hezbollah came out of the 1980s, the war in Lebanon. And in Iraq, we also have the post-invasion days. But the question that I have for you is, to what extent circumstances played a role? Invasion of the Iraq, Arab Spring, civil war in Lebanon, to the rise of Iran as a power in the Middle East. And to what extent this was something that Iranian actually built. It was a constructive power building process.
Sure.
Could one go without the other?
So that's an interesting argument. Historians, depending if you're going to be a structuralist, how you want to approach it. I would argue it's both. Look, opportunity met capability, and that's where Iran is where it is today. For a variety of reasons, things that went on in other countries certainly allowed their militancy to spread across the region, has led to the development of proxy forces across the region. Had other paths been taken, had other events occurred in other nations, they might not be at that point now, but it is where we are now. And it just goes back to the complexity of historical development in the Middle East. It's hard to find a simple, easy chain of causality that takes you there. Again, Americans aren't comfortable with that because our history is very different. It's much simpler in many ways. Whereas Iranian history, like the history of the rest of the region, is extraordinarily complex and intertwined, and you always have to just sort of pause and apply there's always a but when you talk about it. But this, but that, it could have been very different.
But this and but that. So I have about to ask now.
Sure.
2003, so the United States invades Iraq. Many people refer to the invasion of the Iraq as a godsend to the Iranians. And the reason that they say that it's historically speaking, Iraq was a rival of Iran, an obstacle against Iran, and that removed the equation. Soon Iraq and gradually turned to be not a sphere of the influence of Iranian, but an area that Iranian had notable influence. When it comes to the time, 2003 to let's say that 2008 and 2009, we would say that there is a change of behavior or in the way that Americans treated the Iranians middle. At the beginning, the Bush administration was trying to make a harsh stand, and we've seen it in the attack on the Erbil office. But as we got into it, it seems that there was a level of tolerance on the American part side for the Shia activities, for the Iranian meddling in the elections, for the Iranian not engineering necessarily the elections, but intervening in a great extent. The United Iraqi Alliance comes out of it in 2008. What changed that? Why was it? The reason that I'm asking, it's very hard to formulate that. Did the United States change its behavior because it was a matter of fatigue, or because they came to the conclusion that Iran is a Shia country, Iraq is mostly Shia, there will be a level of the Iranian influence. So it was a matter of acceptance of the reality.
You may give us too much credit. Let's go back to how you began. First of all, I would argue the invasion of Iraq was a terrible strategic mistake by the United States.
Wow.
I've said so publicly. This is not the first time I've said it. It was a strategic mistake. If you want to get rid of the leader of Iraq, there are ways to do it that don't involve U.S. tanks in downtown Baghdad. And perhaps we should have spent more time exploring that possibility rather than choosing to invade. So I would argue that was a mistake. And you're also right. What that invasion did was it gave Iran ultimately a path out from the disaster that followed the Iraq-Iran war. It gave them the opportunity to find their footing in the region, to put inroads back into Iraq, and yes, to attack us. And we could never establish what our red lines were going to be. And you mentioned a number of ways where we caved to Iran, but nowhere was the fact that we caved to Iran more glaringly obvious or strategically deficient than our refusal to act when our soldiers and Marines were killed by Iranians in large numbers on the ground in Iraq. And we never actually pushed back hard against Iran and their proxies for those attacks. And we should have done that, and we did not.
What should you have done, and why you didn't?
Well, we should have done some of the things that we've done far more recently. For example, killing Qasem Soleimani then would have probably led us down a very different path.
And why you think the United States at the time didn't take any punitive measure or punishment measure?
I think we struggled inside our own policy councils to decide on a course of action. And so we were muddled, sclerotic, and frozen. And Iran consistently outmaneuvered us on the ground.
So it was a matter of capacity, it was a matter of domestic politics.
It's never a matter of capacity for the United States. It's a matter of decision making. We have the capability, we have the capacity. The question is, will we choose to use and apply that capacity and capability? We chose not to do it then.
Do you think if at the time, if you took any measure, you as a United States, would have things been different with Iran in the region?
Absolutely. Would they have been better? Who knows? But they would certainly have been different. And in many ways, how could they possibly have been worse?
Yes, that's true. You mentioned the attacks on the the American Marines in Iraq, but there
Marines,
was
Marines and soldiers. More soldiers than Marines, simply because there were more soldiers there. But Marines and soldiers bore the brunt of that attack. Some airmen died, some sailors died, but largely it was your ground maneuver forces that bore the brunt of the Shia-based militant attacks.
But there was another attack too, and that was an attack on I think it has a very personal connection with you, the Marine bases in Lebanon in 1980s. The Reagan administration decided to turn a blind eye on making against any direct punishment against the Islamic Republic of Iran. For that too, even though it seems that Iranian hands were visible, and later there were documents, at least things that have been later declassified, showing that CIA had wiretapped a conversation between the Iranian embassy and some other individual elements in Beirut to quote unquote get ready for the big move.
Yes.
Why then, in Iraq, I understand the matter of fatigue and the domestic politics. The Americans were just tired of hearing about the Middle East. That I understand. What it always kind of makes me confused is that why Reagan decided to understand it 20 years later. Why there's a pattern of tolerance?
Well, over a gap of over 40 years, I too remain confused over that decision, except to agree with you that is what happened. Our Marines were killed by terrorists that were directly inspired, enabled by Iranian operatives, possibly conducted by Iranian operatives, but certainly inspired by them. We chose not to respond in any significant way. And as a result, Iran learned a lesson. Mm-hmm. And they applied that lesson over the next ensuing decades, really, I would argue, until the death of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020.
January 2020, which is a great paveway for my next question. We had the Arab Spring, we had the invasion of Iraq as one of the catalysts in Iran's axis of resistance, and then we have the Arab Spring. Arab Spring went through three different stages when it comes to Iran's regional policy. It was first as something positive. It kind of, because it toppled Egypt as a beating heart of the Arab world. Then it was a threat because it got to Syria. And then it turned to be a semi-opportunity because then they went to Syria and they turned Syria from an independent partner to somewhat of a junior South partner. Yes. The architect of all of this seems to be Soleimani. He was the man at least on the field, and he came out of the shadows. When it comes to the development of the Arab Spring, United States and Iran seems to be in a very complex relationship. The beginning, business was as usual, rivalry. Mm-hmm. And then we have a period after 2013-14 to 2017, December after 2017, when you declare victory against ISIS in Iraq. That somewhat of a collaboration, direct or indirect. And I want to ask you, because I believe in if in famous summer of 2017, you were the director of the Joint Staff, which was the time that the United States was launching operation in Mosul and also Fallujah. In both cities, there were also elements of PMFs, mostly encircling the cities rather than being in an urban assault. I want to first start with this. Could you a little bit talk about what happened between Iran and America, between the Quds Force and the Central Command, if there was anything, directly or indirectly or in parallel, in fight against ISIS and in the first half of the Arab Spring?
So I don't think there was ever actually any accommodation between Central Command of the United States and PMF, or in particular Iran here. There might have been some tactical accommodations between Iraqi forces and Iranian forces, and we may have gained some small tactical advantage at some time because some of the things that the Iranians did. But at the higher level, there was no accommodation. There was none that I'm aware of.
Yeah, that's true. And the reason that I'm glad that you mentioned it, because in both the Mosul and Fallujah, two things happen, and to both of them happens. First, PMF wasn't allowed to participate in the urban warfare, which had the U.S. backing. And the second, the Americans were very keen that we are not providing air support to you. We are providing air support to the Iraqi army.
Right.
Back then I was younger at least, and when I was hearing that news, while I could have understand the general rationale behind the decision, one thing that kept me thinking was that why now they don't work? Isn't it an opportunity to de-escalate? Or isn't it an opportunity to build evidently a trust? Was there any opportunity? A young me was just naive.
I think that's an easy observation to make in hindsight.
Yes.
I think on the ground and at the time, there were no incentives to do that.
For either of you or only for you?
I would say for either side.
Oh, really? Oh. And then ISIS kind of you declare victory on it. I think the Iraqi government declared a victory against ISIS on December 9. And by the end of the 2017, ISIS is almost out of the equation in Middle East territorially wise. They lose about 95% of the territories. No major cities being held by them. And then it seems the rivalry goes again between the United States and Iran on peak because now there is no mutual enemy.
Right.
And we have the presidency of President Trump. We have the withdrawal from the JCPOA. And then we have the series of tension between Iran and America beginning in Persian Gulf about the oil tankers, and then the assault of the American compound in the Iraq, which leads to the U.S. decision to kill Qasem Soleimani, to eliminate him. I have two questions. The first question that I do have for you is about that period of time. Do you think United States should have got into the JCPOA from the beginning? And do you think if they got the withdrawal was a decent decision, not a decent decision, strategically speaking, a right decision?
Sure.
And the second, in your book, The Melting Point, you discuss the events prior to the elimination of the Qasem Soleimani. And correct me if I'm wrong, please. I got the gesture that removing him wasn't the first on the agenda. You made an attempt on a base that didn't please the president, and then killing him was an agenda. Elimination of him was an agenda. Is it correct?
So the decision to strike somebody like Qasem Soleimani, that's a presidential decision.
Yes.
So no field commander is going to make that decision.
Of course.
So my position on it was, and others in my intelligence organization, we felt that we needed to strike him for practical, tactical reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Americans would die rapidly, lots of Americans, if he continued to live. We knew the long-term strategic implications of removing him from the battlefield and what it could mean, and we've talked a little bit about that already. But for us, it was an immediate tactical decision. To remove him would allow many people to live that would not otherwise live. The risk of inaction was greater than the risk of action. And that's what drove my recommendations then. Not my decision, because that decision was made by President Trump. I think he made the right decision, and I've never since that time and going back several years until now, I've never regretted that decision. I think it was the right decision then. I think it's the right decision now, and I think events in the region have borne that out.
And what about the JCPOA part?
So a little more difficult. Look, the JCPOA was a flawed agreement. I'm for any agreement that limits Iranian ability to move toward a nuclear weapon. I'm also for any agreement with the United States is engaged with friends and partners, building a fence around Iran, if you will. That gave us the ability to do that. But there are also big holes in that agreement as well. Ultimately, where we are now, I'm not sure that we're in a worse place now, having been out of the JCPOA for several years, and where we are now with Iran than we would be if we'd stayed in it. Look, that's a very difficult decision, very difficult and complex decision. From a military point of view, my perspective was I wanted to ensure that Iran did not act out militarily when we came out of the JCPOA and when we placed maximum pressure on Iran going forward. They did to some degree, but it was also controlled. They did not launch as much, they didn't attack as aggressively as they could have, with the exception of the Soleimani episode. Yeah. But even after Soleimani, you remember their response was very calibrated and muted.
The reason that I'm bringing JCPOA is that I always was kind of curious to know that the tension that came to the Iraq that led to the removal of the Soleimani, the attack on the embassy, the attack on the compound, was it something independent of the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA? Iranian just wanted to inflict pressure to eject you?
So I think it had nothing to do with the JCPOA. It had everything to do with the maximum pressure campaign, which was the broad front economic, diplomatic strategy of really cutting Iran off from the world that the first Trump administration pursued. The Iranian reaction that we saw build up in the middle and fall and winter of 2019 was in fact a response to that, not a response to a JICPOA or anything associated with that. It was rather a direct response to the maximum pressure campaign, in my opinion.
Thank you. And after the death of Soleimani, we have his second command, Ismail Qaani, being in charge, which some of the Iranian outlet calls him the bureaucrat in chief, because he's an expert of paperwork, at least according to those domestic sources. But one of the other things that he's expert, or he claims to be expert, is Afghanistan, which brings us to one of the other, let's say that globally top tier legacy of your work. You have oversaw the largest non-combat evacuation throughout the U.S. history. And that's the top one. Is by I run the data against many things, and no one else has done that. During the withdrawal in Afghanistan, you faced pressure from the ISIS-K. Did you face pressure from the Iranians? Did they wanted to make things complicated, or they wanted to make things for you smooth as possible to just leave?
So that's a great question. Not many people think of that. So as the CENTCOM commander, I was responsible for 21 countries in the region, not just Afghanistan. So I all the time was looking very hard at Iran. We were concerned that they might choose to act out. They did not. And a couple of reasons. We first of all, we brought considerable combat power back into the region when we did the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Iranians are great correlation of forces people. They look at the data. They know what we can do. The Iranians are actually very cold-eyed, cold and clear-eyed when it comes to calculating combat ratios. They knew what would have happened had they interfered with that withdrawal, so they chose not to. Did they wish us well? Absolutely not. And in every way, they would have done anything they could to create a disaster for us. But in terms of direct action, no, they chose not to do that because the consequences of that action were pretty clear to them, and they understand that.
So it was a matter of cost and benefit analysis.
I think on their part, it was a simple matter of cost and benefit analysis.
I think that's the first major event that Qaani oversaw, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then we have upcoming events in the rest of the Arab world.
Right.
When the Soleimani dies, the general understanding, or at least the claim that the Iranian government was pushing, is that the Quds Force is an institution. Our influence, meaning their influence in the region, is institutionalized. Individuals play a role, but the role is very limited. And that is applicable to the late Qasem Soleimani. So that was what they basically wanted. They were saying that nothing had changed, business would go as usual. For the first 2 years seems to be like that. And then we see a series of events against the across the region. One of them is the collapse of Assad's regime within 11 days. The other is the malfunction of the Hezbollah in conflict against the Israelis, which even some Iranian outlets close to the regime, they criticize Hezbollah, specifically speaking when it comes to the counterintelligence. So we have seen a weakness, a flaw in axis of resistance. If Soleimani was in the picture, would things be different? To what extent his absence contributes to the failures of the axis of resistance, if there is any failure in your view? And what other aspects or other elements also contributed in it?
So the death of Soleimani is fundamental to Iranian underperformance in the time since his death. He was the guy who brought it all together. He had a familial relationship with the supreme leader. He could speak outside the Artesh. He had unique advantages when it came to planning, when it came to execution, when it came to gaining approval, when he chose to gain approval. He often didn't choose. He often acted without approval and let events speak for themselves. All of that went away with Qasem Soleimani. And what it exposed was the dangers of cronyism, the dangers of any military organization where a leader stays too long. We've seen that again in the recent Israeli attacks on Iran, where they have removed leaders. And the Iranian response has been the kindest possible way to describe it would be poorly coordinated because there's nobody ready to step into those jobs. The U.S. military has succession planning for everyone. If a commander goes down, another commander will be in that seat within 12 hours. The Iranians don't have that. Their system is rickety. Favoritism abounds. And so it makes it very difficult for an organization like that to function when key leaders are taken out. I say all that simply to explain why I think Iranian performance has generally been so poor since the death of Qasem Soleimani.
So Qasem Soleimani was an exceptional leader among them?
He was their best leader.
Oh.
He was their best leader. He was very good. He spoke fluent Arabic. He had tremendous street credibility with the fighters, none of which apply to his successor.
And you said that he was the best executor, which his merits, at least in comparison to his success and procedure, proves the same thing. I still have and I think many can join me on that, a hard time to understand why the collapse of Assad happened. I understand the role of the Soleimani, but it's still 11 days. I mean, I can kind of point out or make my mind clear that how one can resist for 13 years, and then a man is out of the equation. It goes down in 11 days. What happened? What stopped the Iranians to save him, or in that manner, even Russians?
Well, so I think, Assad's regime depended on support from three elements. Depended on support from Lebanese Hezbollah, depended on support from the Russians, depended on support from Iran. At the time, he came under extreme pressure from internal elements. All three of those other entities had reason for metering their support, for reducing their support for him. So when he needed it the most, it was there the least. Plus, his regime was actually probably, now in hindsight, it's all very clear to us, of course, far more rickety and insubstantial than it appeared at the time. Like a lot of regimes of that nature, it looks very strong, but you nudge it, it comes down like a house of cards. And in fact, it did come down like a house of cards. And the final point is this: he was not his father.
He was not his father.
And he was not his brother,
Yeah.
who was meant to take over but died in a car accident some years ago. He was, when it was all said and done, an evil optometrist, and not a particularly good one.
And we talk about the Shiites who accept of axis of resistance plenty. You were kind to give us your analysis. I want to take it to the Sunni flank, which is the only flank of the Sunni flank of the axis of resistance is the Hamas, which on October 7, 2023, launched a terrorist assault against Israel, comes with the second largest Jewish casualty next to the Holocaust only, and changes the entire destiny of the region. I mean, from there, everything had changed. Now in these days, we are talking about the ceasefire. And the United States strongly pushes, accompanied by many nations, there will be a ceasefire. There will be an end to the bloodshed. The first thing that I wanted to ask you is, I have two questions. The first question is, from the very beginning, why Hamas, they may be ideologic, they may be fanatic, they may be radical, but I think they understand the asymmetry of capability between them and Israelis. They knew Israelis is much more stronger than them. But still, they made the decision on October 7th. Why do you think they made that decision? Did they had the same calculation about that Iranian had about the Americans, that the Americans would tolerate what we do? That was their calculation. And the second one, which is the main question, is what's your assessment on the ceasefire?
Sure.
What is about to happen?
So I think the problem with the Hamas calculation was they underestimated the totality and the ferocity of the Israeli response. They felt that they would and there's some thinking that, they felt they might even get to Tel Aviv. They had plans to push fighters all the way into Tel Aviv.
Wow.
And of course, that didn't happen. It wasn't a militarily feasible thing to do. But they miscalculated the depth of the Israeli response. So they did know the capability of Israel. They knew the capacity of Israel. But what they were unable to divine was the intent of Israel and how it might actually be played out. So Sinwar has been praised by many as someone who learned a lot about Israel during his period of captivity. I would think at the moment of his death, he had to feel he knew very little about Israel, except that they make great drones. So I think that's a problem. And I just think that was the miscalculation. Now, as to what's happened now, I would argue where we're at in the peace process right now is really due to President Trump. And I would actually say based on President Trump's decision to strike Qasem Soleimani. He has enormous clout in the region because of that decision, which no American president could ever take before or was willing to take before. Presidents of both parties examined the Soleimani problem, never acted on it. President Trump acted, and it set the Iranians back. And we've already talked about the degree to which that set them back. And the second thing President Trump did was he made the decision to strike the Iranian nuclear program. So those two things taken together give an object lesson for everyone in the region about the boundaries of what President Trump is willing to do. He's willing to go well beyond what presidents before him have been willing to do. And I think that unique perspective on the force he might be willing to employ under certain circumstances has a tendency to gather people together in a way that they might not otherwise be gathered together.
Wow. You mentioned the strike against the Iranian nuclear facility, and you had a really great conversation with our colleague, Dr. Schnaufer, about Operation Midnight Hammer. It seems the Iranian response to the Americans' involvement was modest, I believe so. I might be wrong.
I think modest with a small m.
Really?
Yes.
Why was that?
They did not want to invite further retaliation. The Iranians have no capability to defend themselves, certainly not then, even not much more now. They would essentially be naked before their enemies. They did not want to invite massive response. And that sword hangs over their head today.
And do you think they have how long is going to take them to rebuild or recover from that damage?
I don't know that the Israelis are going to allow them to do that. I think if the Iranians begin to re-implement air defense systems, I think you will see the Israelis strike those systems pretty quickly.
So the ceasefire is just a ceasefire. It's not a peace.
I don't think anybody's under the misapprehension that it's a peace.
Do you think these news that we are hearing here and there, that there is a large cargo of the Russians or Chinese heading for Tehran on and off, they would make the Israelis' calculation escalated, or they are not going to have any impact on that?
First of all, I'd like to see that actually happen.
Okay.
I'm not sure it's actually happening. But second, it takes a while to set up air defense systems. And while those systems are being set up, they are uniquely vulnerable. And Iran remains uniquely vulnerable today to Israeli action, both from the air and on the ground.
On the ground. And I wanted to add, which brings us to the last stage of this interview. And thank you sorry for taking your time. We talk about the Midnight Hammer. We talk about the October 7. Many things happened during the last 3 years, as many things happens during your time of command. If you were still in charge of the CENTCOM on the day after October 7, and from there to now, you've been renewed, or for some reason you've still been in charge, what would you do against Hamas, against Hezbollah, and toward the Iranian-Israelis war in June of the 2024?
So the job of the CENTCOM commander is to provide the president options.
Okay.
So that any president, Republican or Democrat, can make decisions, and the military element of power will support him. So I think CENTCOM has done a pretty good job since October the 7th. Again, what finally changed was you had a president who has the credibility and the force to actually impose his will on the situation and hopefully create a long-term peace in Gaza. As we speak today, we're still a couple of days away from that actually occurring. I think there's still a lot of things that can happen to derail it, but we are certainly closer now than we have ever been. And it's not necessarily American military power that did that. It's rather the perception of American political will that allowed this to happen. And that's not a military thing. That's a presidential thing.
Thank you. And that brings us actually to my final question when you say the presidential thing. 3 years remained after President Trump's presidency, his second term. What do you think would be his top-notch challenges in the Middle East in the coming years? And what is your advice to him?
So in the short term, by that I mean probably for this 3-year period, what you want to see is you want to see the path to normalization continue between Israel and its Arab neighbors. I think that's very important. In the long term, as we began the interview, you'd like to find a way to ease Iran back into the family of nations as a responsible nation that respects its neighbors, doesn't meddle in their affairs, and understands that Israel is going to exist as a state. That's a long-term goal. You're not going to get there this year, next year, or the year after. But what you can do in the short term is you need to continue to demonstrate to Iran by various forms of collective security that attacking their neighbors is not a profitable enterprise.
So it's continuing the deterrence with Iran and pushing for the de-escalation between the Arab world and Israel.
I would agree with both those points.
These are your advices to President Trump.
Yes, it is.
Thank you, General McKenzie. That was very nice.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. And that was the last episode of GNSI's Axis of Resistance initiative. I want to thank you for your time and watching this. In addition, I want to ask you a favor. Please tune in with the GNSI's upcoming research campaigns.